The lights of Istanbul's secure compound burn late into the night as a small convoy pulls through the gates. Inside, away from cameras and official podiums, Turkey's intelligence chief, Ibrahim Kalın, sits down with senior Hamas figures, led by chief negotiator Khalil al-Hayya, for talks that go to the heart of the post-war Gaza order. Their meeting, confirmed by Turkish security sources, focuses on the next phases of the Gaza ceasefire plan and how it will be implemented on the ground. At the centre of this quiet choreography stands President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, still the president of Turkey and still one of the most outspoken critics of Israel's campaign in Gaza. Publicly, he has framed the war in the harshest possible terms and cast Turkey as both protector of Palestinian rights and a power willing to challenge Western alignments. Behind closed doors, his security services are now hosting Hamas's top negotiators, helping shape a ceasefire architecture that could either stabilize the region or entrench new lines of confrontation. Kalın is no ordinary spy chief. A former presidential spokesperson and longtime Erdogan confidant, he now heads the National Intelligence Organization, which reports directly to the presidency. His presence in these talks signals that what is unfolding in Istanbul is not a routine courtesy call. It is part of a strategic file personally owned by Erdogan. For Hamas, meeting Kalın in Turkey offers something they badly need: a powerful state actor willing to give them a channel, legitimacy among sympathetic governments, and a stake in how the ceasefire is monitored and enforced. The Istanbul discussions come at a sensitive moment after years of devastating conflict and the deaths of multiple senior Hamas leaders, including Ismail Haniyeh, assassinated in Tehran in 2024. The movement's leadership has shifted. Khalil al-Hayya has emerged as one of Hamas's most influential external figures and chief negotiator, operating largely from abroad and tasked with navigating between pressure from Israel, Arab mediators, Iran, Qatar, and now Turkey. For Ankara, engaging with al-Hayya is about more than managing a single truce. It is about having a direct line into the evolving leadership of Hamas at a time when ceasefire terms, prisoner exchanges, disarmament debates, and the future governance of Gaza are all in flux. Officially, Turkish security sources describe the Kalın-Hamas talks as technical mechanisms to ensure the smooth operation of the ceasefire, ways to address violations, and procedures for subsequent stages of an agreed plan. But the political context makes those technicalities deeply political. Erdogan has repeatedly accused Israel of committing atrocities in Gaza and challenged Western governments for, in his view, enabling them. In international forums and bilateral meetings, he has sharpened his language rather than softened it. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan said this is completely a genocide, directly blaming Israel's leadership for the scale of Palestinian casualties. For supporters, this stance reinforces Turkey's claim to moral leadership on the Palestinian question. For critics, it underscores Ankara's alignment with Hamas and deepens the rift with Israel and some of its Western partners. The question that follows naturally and frames your video's title is whether these Istanbul meetings amount to an anti-Israel plan or something more complex. A hard-edged negotiating track in which Turkey backs Hamas politically while pushing it toward an arrangement that Ankara can defend internationally. On one level, Ankara's objectives are clear and consistent. Turkey wants a ceasefire that holds a substantial easing of restrictions on Gaza, visible steps toward Palestinian political recognition, and a process that sidelines any scenario of mass displacement. Turkish officials also want to ensure that any monitoring or stabilization mechanism for Gaza is not dominated solely by Western or Israeli preferences. Ankara has already positioned itself as a mediator and potential guarantor, hosting ministerial talks and calling for stronger international involvement in supervising ceasefire terms. On another level, Erdogan's government uses this file to reinforce its regional brand. By engaging directly with Hamas leaders in Istanbul, Turkey signals to Arab and Muslim publics that it is not stepping back under Western pressure. It is instead offering Hamas a diplomatic umbrella at a time when parts of the Arab world are more cautious, divided, or focused on reconstruction. For Hamas, whose traditional backers have paid a heavy price in the wider regional confrontation, the Turkish door is strategically valuable. Inside the Istanbul meeting rooms, the agenda is reported to revolve around how to sequence the ceasefire's next stages. That includes the pace and scale of humanitarian access, the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, potential security guarantees, and whether any international presence, observers, police, or a mixed stabilization mechanism could operate in Gaza without being seen as an occupying force. Kalın's team comes with a clear message. Turkey wants structures it can publicly defend and practically support. But this is where Erdogan's rhetoric shapes perceptions of those talks. By branding Israel's actions in Gaza as crimes and repeatedly challenging its legitimacy, he narrows the political space to be seen as a neutral facilitator. That fuels Israeli suspicions that any mechanism designed in Istanbul will tilt toward Hamas interests and embed a narrative of Israeli culpability. It also raises the question Western diplomats are debating privately. Is Ankara trying to engineer a ceasefire framework that constrains Israel, rehabilitates elements of Hamas's political leadership, and enhances Turkey's leverage all at once? From Hamas's perspective, any plan discussed in Istanbul must address three strategic needs. First, survival of its leadership structure in some form, especially with the deaths of figures such as Yahya Sinwar and Haniyeh, and repeated targeted strikes in Gaza, Lebanon, and Qatar. Second, political relevance in a post-war Gaza that will be under intense pressure to change its governance model. Third, guarantees that any commitments it makes on hostages, rockets, or border control are backed by credible mediators who can pressure Israel if it is seen to renege. Turkey is one of the few actors that can partially speak to all three. Erdogan has maintained open lines to Hamas while still being a NATO ally, engaging Washington and European capitals and working with Qatar and Egypt on mediation tracks. Turkish intelligence has long-run channels into Palestinian factions, enabling it to convene meetings that would be difficult elsewhere. For Hamas, being received by Kalın in Istanbul rather than only in Doha or Beirut signals that they retain backing from a significant regional power with institutional reach. However, those benefits come with costs and constraints. Open association with Hamas deepens the crisis in Turkey-Israel relations, which have plunged to new lows since the war and since Erdogan began accusing Israel of genocide on global stages. It complicates Turkey's ties with Western allies who regard Hamas as a terrorist organization and are wary of any framework that appears to legitimize its leadership. It also raises domestic questions about how far Ankara is prepared to go. Rhetorical confrontation is one thing. Embedding Turkish structures in a volatile post-war Gaza file is another. So is there an anti-Israel plan being drawn up in Istanbul? The reality is more layered than the slogan. What is clearly emerging is a coordinated effort by Turkey to shape the ceasefire endgame in a way that limits Israel's freedom of action, amplifies Palestinian political claims, and keeps Hamas, or at least its surviving leadership, inside the diplomatic tent rather than exiled from it. That may look like an anti-Israel posture from Jerusalem's viewpoint, especially given Erdogan's public accusations and his refusal to appear alongside Israeli leaders at multilateral events. But inside the talks, the language is more technical. Verification mechanisms, phased timelines, security guarantees, humanitarian corridors. Critically, these Istanbul meetings sit on top of a broader map of negotiations and rivalries. Qatar and Egypt continue to play central roles as mediators. The United States and European states are pressing for a framework that reduces Hamas's military capacity and prevents a return to large-scale hostilities. Israel is seeking assurances on hostages, security control, and the future of Hamas's command structure. Arab states are weighing reconstruction commitments against domestic anger. In that crowded field, Turkey is carving out a function as the mediator closest to Hamas, taking the political risk others will not. This proximity gives Ankara insight and leverage, but it also ties its reputation to the choices Hamas makes. If Hamas's negotiators use the Istanbul track to secure steps toward de-escalation, sustained ceasefire, monitored borders, political restructuring in Gaza, Turkey can claim that engagement works better than isolation. If, however, Hamas uses the space to regroup without delivering on core commitments, then Erdogan's strategy will be portrayed by critics as having shielded a movement responsible for deadly attacks on civilians while further poisoning relations with Israel and portions of the West. For now, what happened behind those closed doors in Istanbul reflects a tactical convergence of interests. Hamas needs sponsors and channels. Turkey needs influence and a defining role in any final Gaza settlement. Both share a deep hostility toward the current Israeli leadership and its conduct of the war. The outcome of that convergence will be tested in the coming phases of ceasefire implementation, whether violations fall, whether prisoners are exchanged, whether reconstruction begins, and whether any credible pathway emerges toward a political order in Gaza that the region and the wider international community can live with. In the end, the story behind the Istanbul talks is less about a single secret plot and more about how power, narrative, and negotiation intersect. A NATO member state led by a president who openly accuses Israel of atrocities is hosting senior figures from a movement designated as a terrorist organization by many of its allies to discuss the blueprint of a fragile peace. That paradox is precisely what makes these meetings consequential and why the next steps taken in Istanbul will resonate far beyond the shores of the Bosphorus